but you're still gaining. Its skillfulness is something that is really, you know, beyond belief. Made me think of one thing here. I'm always looking for some text I can't find, right? Yeah, this is from Gyaltsen Rinpoche. The problem is that our lives are much too short. If we lived 1,000 years, we would never exhaust the lessons to be learned from the Buddha's teachings. The lessons and realizations simply become deeper and more profound. If you studied forever, the wealth of the teachings could not be exhausted. They are like a great ocean. The time never comes when nothing is left to be learned. The depth of wisdom that can be derived from these teachings has no limits. We have this statement on our website, written by this Chinese temple, the Shan Temple in Toronto, I think. Buddhism is a teaching about how to live in peace, joy, and harmony. It shows us how to be liberated from cravings, greed, addictions, envy, prejudice, anger, hatred, ill will, confusion, fear, and ignorance. In short, it is about freeing ourselves from all afflictions that cause suffering. Ultimately, it directs the followers to break the bondage of birth and death through their own efforts and wisdom. On a higher level, it is the teaching beyond worldly knowledge, which leads to the realization of the truth, the reality of all things. Think of that. On the higher level, it is the teaching beyond worldly knowledge, which leads to the realization of the truth, the reality of all things. It's just a remarkable thing. I can't help it, but for my own sort of stumblings and imperfect study, and certainly imperfect meditation, it's just the most remarkable gift of human beings to one another. It's this completely unbroken lineage of 2,600 years. I think sometimes, yesterday, for instance, was the 100th anniversary of the founding of this church, in Emmanuel Baptist. And, it made me think about what a wonderful thing just to continue to exist. But at the same time, sort of all the divisions within Christianity, say in the West, Christianity has been basically broken apart since 1054, if you can imagine that. So these days, you say what Christian belief is, you can't really put a finger on it, what a Christian might believe, someone who identifies as a Christian. The Buddhists, we are so fortunate because we had from the beginning, the Buddha taught for 40 some odd years after his great enlightenment. And this is just a tremendous advantage because there's this body of practical experience and history that people could take confidence in, and the influence that he had. We know 200 years after the Buddha passed away, the first Western contact with India was Alexander the Great. He conquered all the way to India. And it was some of his emissaries who, maybe even 100 years after that, colonies they left. At any rate, this first contact with India from Western sources, people that were writing in Greek. So we have records of India as it was like 200 years after the Buddha's passing. And they were talking about the animal sacrifices that were made. This is what the Greeks reported on. But then we have the reports of this Chinese pilgrim who went through India, some 500, 600, 700 years later. He was on a big pilgrimage learning, collecting sutras and things, bring them back to China. And lo and behold, he reported the whole country was vegetarian. So the remarkable influence of the Buddha Dharma is practical right down to earth, like it says in their statement here, a teaching about how to live in peace, joy, and harmony, how to be liberated from all those negative mind states. In short, freeing ourselves from all afflictions that cause suffering. But those teachings, how to do that, came out of the Buddhas and then following, great masters thereafter, out of their experience of what? The realization of the truth, the reality of all things, the teaching beyond worldly knowledge. It is this teaching beyond worldly knowledge which is very hard for us to naturally accept. Our society, our culture doesn't support that. It thinks of all of that stuff as kind of superstition or something. And yet we know now, again, as I was speaking, I think it was the last week, of this cutting edge of the thought that's going on in scientific circles about recognizing that how we see things, how we have evolved as human beings, as sentient beings, not speaking of the mind now, but just how we've literally biologically evolved. The engine of evolution is not truth, which is what the Buddha is talking about. The engine of evolution is fitness, which just means what helps pass your genes on to the next generation. So we see things in a fundamentally dualistic way. Fundamentally, what I want, the good things that are going to help me, and then the bad things that could threaten that I push away. That's how we exist in this worldly way. That's totally what the Buddha said. But the difference is that the scientific world says, well, that's all we can see, so we're just going to stop there. Whereas the Buddha said, no, there's more to it than that. There is realization of our true nature, of truth itself, and we're not separate from that truth. So there are scientists these days that are saying that, we see things in a limited way through this necessary need for fitness, but that consciousness is something that's well beyond that. And there's no thing, even these scientists say, that should limit human beings from being able to go beyond that, so to speak, to see how even the teachings on time and space are limited, conceptual. So this is very heady stuff. But for us, good grief, freeing ourselves from the afflictions that cause suffering sounds pretty good. And that's where we start. After his great enlightenment, what did the Buddha first teach? It's really amazing. To me, it's so meaningful that he hesitated to teach. It shows that he wasn't in it for fame and gain. That he had such great compassion for people, that he saw that the possibility of even misleading people through their own ignorance. But then he did teach, and he taught for 45 years. And his first teaching, though, is what? The truth, the noble truth of suffering. That this dissatisfaction that we feel, it's not because there's something wrong with you. This dissatisfaction that we feel, this suffering that we see, incompleteness all around the world, wherever we look. That's the state of this unenlightened existence, but that's not the whole story. But when you can see that, then suddenly everything opens up in a certain way, because you're not trying to manufacture something. You're not looking for love in the wrong places. You're not trying to find a relationship that's going to completely settle your heart forever. You're not trying to find a career that's going to do that, or build some corporation or some huge reputation as a conqueror or something that's going to establish your reputation for all of history. So you stop looking into things for solutions that cannot provide the solution. Lo and behold, we have, because of 2,600 years of development, and because of the decades that the Buddha was able to actually physically talk to people, and his great enlightenment, and the complete development of India for 1,500 years, we have resources there. We have the tools that can satisfy our heart. We don't have to be afraid of doubt or self-doubts or any of those things. It teaches us how to deal with those things and to not empower them themselves, to allow our own true nature to blossom like a lotus opening up. I mentioned that the different Tibetan traditions have slightly different. Garamche talks about different facets of the same jewel. And so, speaking to the Nyingma conceptualization of the path, he talks about 9 different levels. And so, in our book, the 37 Bodhisattva practices, that's level 3, you might say. But the thing to understand is that each level completely contains all the others. So it's not like some sort of like we're shopping and, oh my goodness, I like Gucci more than I like whatever. It's not like that. You can go all the way to Buddhahood, but different strokes for different folks, and different needs arise at different times in your practice. But again, it's an unfolding. It's not us trying to manipulate our own realization, because truth be told, we're actually realized right now, but we don't know it. That's how subtle it is. So Khenpo is always talking, about emptiness. When he talked about the 5 paths to Buddhahood, those are the teachings on emptiness. This is like the 3rd level, the Bodhisattva path. The 6 levels above that are also part, but they're the extraordinary Bodhisattva path, sometimes called Vidyadharas, wisdom holders. We act as if we're actually possessing wisdom itself, whereas in the 3rd level, the Bodhisattva path, we're going for the perfection of wisdom. So we recognize that our wisdom is limited. That's how we conceive of ourselves. We're working higher to the perfection of wisdom. So in the Bodhisattva path, we're kind of looking up to wisdom, but on the 6 tantric paths, we're actually looking down to wisdom. So one is prajna, and jna is wisdom, knowledge, but pra is beyond, so perfection of wisdom. But the other way, looking down, we're doing yeshe, which is spontaneous wisdom, wisdom just as it is. So it's the same thing. It's the same thing, really, but just different methods. So when we talk about emptiness, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, has taught regular meditation on emptiness begins the deconstruction process, deconstructing appearances as real. If one is diligent and continues meditation on emptiness, it will happen that you will arise from the cushion after a meditation session is over. There will be a short time when everything seen by the eyes has an ethereal, dreamlike quality. Things actually for a brief time will appear like illusions. They appear, yet we are deeply convinced that they are false. This deep conviction is more than intellectual. It is felt experience. Deconstruction of the ego leads directly to unconditional love for all beings. Emaho. That's what he said. Emaho. I'm told that this expression, emaho, that we have, in some of our prayers, is said to be what the sentient being says when finding themselves being reborn in Amitabha's Pure Land. It's just an expression of just complete gratitude and wonder and bliss. Emaho. So we hear teachings like this, and it's very helpful because you realize there's some sort of a conceptual path that you can understand, that you can question, that you can check, so to speak. And then one practices, and you can see, first of all, is there a cessation of suffering in your life? And of course, there is, even knowing that there's the possibility of liberation from suffering. Because if you're suffering and you don't even know, then it's like it's the most horrible thing in the world. I look at the worldly beings and I wonder, I guess it's because they don't know, but it's just the suffering when it's just like something completely unwarranted, horrible, falling down out of heaven on your head, and there's nothing you can do. How terrible. But again, in my own greatly limited experience, just hearing the Buddha's teaching that there is an end to suffering, the possibility of it being out there, it's like there's just a little bit of light in your mind, or you might say there's just a little bit of peace. It's not completely like tsunamis going on all the time. And this is very helpful. So the regular meditation on emptiness speaks to us perfectly, just as we are. You know, the tantric teachings we present at a temple like this, we try to offer, at least expose people to the full range of Buddha's teachings. That's very important. But the Tantra especially has, special challenges, again, because we don't have a cultural support for it. In Guru Yoga, similarly. But at the same time, the power and the benefit of these are such that we should not keep ourselves away from them for some sort of limited reasoning, thinking that, oh, this is sort of beyond me, I'm not at that level. That's all wrong thought. That's just the ego. You don't even know. There's no way it would be inappropriate for anyone who's even seen like Gar Rinpoche's picture. You're qualified. You're not only a sentient being, you've got Buddha nature. And in the immensity of cause and effect, in the immensity of time and space, it's happened that you've even had this kind of interaction with your mind stream, with his. It's tremendously significant. We talk a lot about Shantideva's, Bodhicharya Avatara entering the Bodhisattva path. Dalai Lama says it's his favorite book. Chapter 9 is all about wisdom. And of course, it's mind-bogglingly profound and to read it. And yet I came across something here, because there are these famous verses, which I'm going to read, just 4 verses here, the heart, so to speak, of the chapter of wisdom. But it is argued, Shantideva speaking, if it is understood that thought is only like illusion, how is passion turned aside? Even as she is created, the magician falls in love with the illusory woman that he creates in his mind. It goes on. I'm just going to read that one verse because there's a commentary on this creation of this illusory woman. So even as she is created, the magician falls in love with the illusory woman. Indeed, the impression of passion on our mind has not been worn out. In that moment of beholding her, his impression of emptiness is weak, and such is the problem. So what they're saying here is that when we were talking in Kempo's, the path of meditation, talk about all the levels up to Buddhahood, all of those until you get to the 8th and 9th level, it's all the purification of the kleshas, the passions, the afflictions. Again, it's said that our mind is like, the process is like you have a wooden box, and there's a handkerchief, a cloth inside that box that's been soaked in perfume. That handkerchief is our passions. You can practice removes all the kleshas from your mind, and yet the smell lingers in that box. It's only the purification of wisdom that completely removes the smell. And this is what the passions are. Even when the passions are gone from our mind, the habit of them is still there. And this is the lingering smell. So this Maya woman, the woman of illusion, is a familiar figure in Sanskrit literature, usually created out of poisons. Of course, it's referring to the outer world. It's not, you can think of a magician creating the emanation of a beautiful woman, or for that matter, a woman creating an image of a beautiful man, whatever, doesn't matter. A variation of the story given in a manner which makes altruistic changes that are most revealing of the true spirit of the Mahayana, is quoted in the Siksha Samuchaya. This is Shantideva's other great work. I don't know that it's been translated in English. And in his book, the Siksha Samuchaya, he quotes from a sutra called the Tathagata Gyuha, the secret Tathagata. Tathagata means the thus come one. There was nothing you could say about the Buddha. His mind was so vast that anything you said was seemingly like a lie or a misapprehension. So they called him the Tathagata, the thus come one. Here he is. To demonstrate the point that when a bodhisattva is penetrated by the law body, by the Dharmakaya, highest realization, when the bodhisattva is penetrated by the Dharmakaya, just hearing him or touching anything created by him works to one's advantage. The bodhisattva Vaidhyaraja, the king of medicine, this is the bodhisattva, the king of medicine, the master of all elements of healing, created the shape of a lovely woman's body, and all men who loved her were cured instantly of every infirmity, a phenomenon which one may note to be an extremely practical type of religion. Just so, this is quoting the text again, when the bodhisattva has the Dharmakaya, this high realization, all beings, women, men, boys, girls, distressed by passions, faults, delusion, who touch his body, no sooner do they touch it than all their passions are calmed, and they feel that the distress has left their bodies. That is, by the purity that comes from this bodhisattva's former devotion. For this reason, the person must be purified. And in Shantideva's verses, the conceptions of the illusory woman passes from an ethical to a metaphysical plane, and she becomes an equivocal figure to be taken as symbolic of the whole phenomenal world. This is Guru Yoga. And this, despite all of us wanting to say, we've had people, who come here and they say, well, this is just too much for me. And it's a misunderstanding, and that's really kind of sad, because at the same time, people can have contact, something's positive, but certainly they've experienced that with a great teacher like Gar Rinpoche. You don't know anything about Buddhism. I couldn't tell you what color that deity is supposed to be, what his name is. I can't pronounce it. I don't know any of this stuff. I don't know the Four Noble Truths. I don't know nothing. And yet you can feel the peace in your heart mysteriously, seemingly unwarranted, just by having contact with a being like that. So this is the highest teaching, Guru Yoga. It's said that Jigten Sumgön says that the devotion of the student melts the ice of the glacier, and the water, pure water, flows to the student. It's that simple. But of course, when we practice like this, we find easily our own doubts, our own obscurations, our own limitations. And we come up with all sorts of good sounding reasons, fearful reasons, self-doubting reasons, all of that. The important thing is just to keep going. Don't close your accounts with reality. Just keep going. Certainly, a great teacher is very helpful in that way, because anytime you get spun out in some sort of big, huge area, you get kind of taken down to earth. Interactions with the teacher can be like that, certainly. I mean, I've had that experience where you have some, conceptual teaching, question that you're wrestling with, some huge self-doubt or something. I once went to Lama Tarchin in a moment of, personal need and crisis. He didn't say anything. I sat down in front of him. I came all the way across the country to see him, and he just had me sit down in his house, which is kind of nice. People didn't get to go to his house, but he realized, I guess, that I needed it. And he just sat me down. He handed me a box of Kleenex. And all he said was, guilt doesn't help. So, but to have someone like that, to say something that you can truly have confidence in, confidence in things that you don't see, and yet you do have confidence in them. A wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. So to touch the bodhisattva's body, and of course, this is to see. You're touching by seeing. It's extremely beneficial, just totally wonderful. And faith building, even though we don't know. So the path is, yes, what do? We have to do study and practice together. Doesn't mean you become a PhD, but we do the study that's necessary to support the practice that we're doing. Also from Gyalta Rinpoche. Speaking about those on the Hinayana path, that's not any particular tradition. Hinayana path is that of self-liberation. That your whole goal is self-liberation. Those on the Hinayana path, the smaller path, consider the vows of discipline to be the most important. You must understand that here, in the vehicle of the bodhisattvas, the main vow is to develop bodhicitta. And that's all Shantideva's book is about. So it boils down to something that's very simple. All of these vast methods, all of these different pure lands, all of these different symbols. When you read the detailed description of the refuge tree, it is just mind-boggling in detail. And people can feel discouraged about that, but there's no need for that. The teachings even cover that, how to deal with that kind of discouragement or doubt. But nonetheless, the main vow is to develop bodhicitta. And then what happens is, as you do learn more, whether it's just showing up for teachings or your own personal study or whatever, these things start, you see the interrelatedness of these things, that it's all just an expression of bodhicitta. And then suddenly what seemed to be so multifaceted and complex becomes very simple. And then suddenly the practice in the checkout counter, someone doesn't know anything about Buddhism, no problem. You're dealing with their Buddha nature, and your expression of your Buddha nature is your bodhicitta. You don't have to try to remember any practices or anything like that. It will unfold. And where you make mistakes, it says the bodhisattva stumbles, but the bodhisattva picks themselves up by pushing off the ground. What does that mean? You're taking the vow to liberate sentient beings. That's the ground again. We use that to purify our own mistakes of dealing with sentient beings. So I had a trial this week, and I was appointed by the court. I was the fourth attorney this woman had, and rather a wild individual. She had gotten convicted the day before of breaking one of her baby daddy's windshields with a gun. Very wild character. Anyway, family court matter, and we were waiting to get called in. And the other lawyer, who had been very mean to me on the internet with emails, he asked if the trial could be postponed. Before I showed up, I guess they'd had lots of postponements and that, and he wanted to postpone it again because he had his annual vacation. And the judge said no, and I had shot off my mouth. I checked with my client; she didn't want to delay it, so I said no. We don't agree to delay it. Of course, he got all mad at me. So this is the first time I had met him. So we're all waiting to go in to see the courtroom. My client didn't show up. His client was there, a very wonderful guy, talking about taking the burden for this kid, a kid with lots of problems, little kid, developmental problems and that. And this guy's working 3 jobs, and I mean, he's a good father from everything I could see. Attorney for the child was there, so 3 lawyers. And lawyers are talking, and they all know each other, and and I'm sort of on the periphery. People see me, but don't necessarily know me necessarily. I didn't know this other lawyer at all, but he's very lawyerly and penetrating questions. He's kind of an aggressive kind of guy, and things were warming up a little bit, and then suddenly out of nowhere, he said, "Why did you come to Rochester?" And I said, "Well, I came for the Rochester Zen Center." Blank. And try and make it a little easier for him, Yeah, I was kind of interested, in studying, practicing Buddhism. How about them bills? Just completely went in a different direction. We don't want to go there at all. And this is what, is painful because this is so normal, ordinary. Be kind to people. It's deeper than that simple kindness and the path to eliminate your sufferings. But we don't know, we just don't know. The thing is that none of us have been born at the wrong time. We can get into all sorts of self-criticisms and self-doubts and all sorts of stuff. We just have to accept this for the gift that it is. Where they have questions, we work on it. It's the engagement of our mind. It's not blind faith. It's not just accepting something. But through that process, because it's real, through that process of working on it sincerely, what did Jesus say? He that knocks, the door shall be opened. One thing, true and beautiful, and it permeates everything else. All the religions, all the virtuous activities of the irreligious, that's all our true nature. People see it in a limited way, that's fine. Kempo talked about these 5 paths that we're talking about in this 3rd level, the Bodhisattva path. And then in the Tantra, it's given in a very inner interpretation, of the moment that we die, the moment that we're wandering in the bardo, that we're accumulating in the bardo experiences, the moment before, when we see the moment of our conception, and then taking birth. The path of no more learning is the path of the Bodhisattva, the realized Bodhisattva. So it's all there. And that's what's so wonderful about it. We don't have to give up our doubts. We don't do any violence to our mind. We just look into our mind. And all of these things, all the symbolism, everything, it's all tools that allow us to do that effectively. I mean, think about it. Even this gesture of prayer, putting your hands together. I mean, it has an effect on the mind, because there really isn't this body-mind split ultimately. You put your hands together, it's very hard to be just a total a-hole, excuse me, when your hands are like this. Whereas if you make it into a fist, it's very easy. So it seems like an artificial thing. And of course, prostrations are even more so like that. They're actually a wisdom practice. We think of it in our American ways, this is just totally physical. Like Lama Tarchan's wife used to joke, it's weight loss through Dharma. But it's actually mental, because you start doing it, and first of all, the visualization completely goes away. You're just completely involved. Oh, my knee hurts, and can I do this again? And how many more? I get out my Dharma calculator. How many before I get to 100,000? All this stuff. You're just lost. Distractions. But that's wisdom. You're seeing your distraction. That's the aware aspect of your mind. And that's good. So there's a lot, there's a lot. It can seem overwhelming, but at the same time, it really comes down that it's pretty simple. And that simple engagement, even like the little children here, they don't have these conceptual palaces that I'm trying to cram Dharma into. No, it's just this experience of, the Lama is someone who's just a compassionate person. They smell the incense, they hear the music. It's a very pure kind of experiential thing. They're not loading themselves up with all sorts of obstacles. But they're human beings, they have obstacles to purify too, but at least they're not building more. And so too for us. It's all this path of purification, and it all just boils down to bodhicitta. Okay, let's stop there for this morning. Certainly recommend chapter 9, verses 31 through 35 of Shantideva's text. I'll just read 35 to conclude. when neither existence nor non-existence is presented to the mind, then, through lack of any other possibility, that which is without support becomes tranquil. It's said that when Shantideva recited this verse, that he actually levitated. Those of you who may not know the story is that he was a monk. He was a prince, I think, and renounced his kingdom to become a monk. And he went to Nalanda, this great university in ancient India, and he was meditating all night. But during the day, people didn't see him doing anything. So the other monks didn't like him, and they called him the monk with three functions: eating, sleeping, and defecating. And they thought they had this rotating thing where once a month, I think, one of the monks had to get up and give a Dharma talk. And so they thought they'd play a big joke and get Shantideva up there, and he would be so embarrassed at his failure to publicly say anything sensible that he would leave the monastery. So his enemies thought. So he got up and he gave this. He gave How to Enter the Bodhisattva Path, this incredible poem of 10 chapters. But when he got to those verses, that one verse in the heart of the wisdom chapter, it said that he levitated out of sight. They couldn't see him anymore. They could just hear the words. He continued reciting chapter 9 and the rest of chapter 10. So they were kind of scared that they realized they had been tormenting a great bodhisattva. So highly recommend it. If it's the Dalai Lama's favorite book, I got to believe there's something in there that's worth my time, right? Okay, let's stop there. Any questions right now before we take our break? Kempo's coming.
Yeah. Let me say that it was Kempo's birthday on Friday. It was past Friday, and so we had a little celebration happening after practice today. But I just wanted to alert people if you want to read and wish them happy birthday. That would be the link.
Okay. Okay. Take a break and we'll ring a bell.